I guess I should be formal and introduce Vern. Everyone knows Vern, but we are thrilled to have him here talking about his latest project.
Thanks. This is joint work with Stuart Staniford at Silicon Defense and Nick Weaver, who's a grad student at UC Berkeley. And we started with, to frame things, what could you do if you controlled 1 million hosts and you're an attacker? Obviously a lot of nasty stuff, but it's sort of good to walk through a little bit of it. The first thing that comes to mind is DDoS. You've got 1 million hosts, that's a lot of zombies. And in particular, with that many, you can sort of change the usual game a bit because the attacks can be so diffuse. This means, for example, no need to spoof addresses. Hosts can just use the radio addresses and zip right through any ingress filtering because there's so many of them that it's administratively intractable to either filter them or trace them down anyway. You can also afford to make low-rate requests. You don't have to hammer away, so you can not trigger IDSs that are looking for high-volume sources. You can also afford to make legitimate requests. You don't have to be flooding. You can be fetching pages off of the servers you're after or doing DNS lookups. That's extremely hard for the victim to filter. Bottom line being, if you have those 1 million hosts, it's way beyond the state-of-the-art of defense. Furthermore, 1 million is so many that you can do a bunch all at once, say 100 concurrently that are each quite big and diffuse. Or you could take your 1 million and strike them across 100 targets. And what would you go after? Well, this slide's old, but it's wrong then obvious if you're just looking for crippling the net in general. You go after various name servers. You go after mailing lists used to coordinate response to network attacks. You might go after the upgrade sites, depending on how well they are protected by, say, optimization. You may be able to prevent access to them. You might go after news servers if your goal is to spread panic and the like. That's overt attack. If you've got your 1 million, you can do other things. You can rummage through their contents, looking for stuff. And obvious things are, for example, credit card numbers or address books, so you get the patterns of user activity. Maybe even illicit content if you're looking for blackmail or such. You can also just search for needles and haystacks. You've got so much processing power, and if you're that diverse, you may have access to a desktop that is exceedingly rare to have access to, like sitting in a NOC or something. But because your coverage is so broad, 1 of your 1 million will still have that property. And the last thing you can do is you can confuse or hinder whoever you're attacking, destroying information. Clearly, corrupting information can be even better, depending on the degree of sophistication you can use in corrupting it. In some cases, you can damage hardware, flash BIOSes. We're looking into whether you can alter the cooling on the boards by software-controlled fans. Send out misinformation if you're trying to take advantage of the fact that you have a presence on an implicitly trusted host. We wanted to quantify some of this, and the one number we were able to find, it's hard to find these numbers, but we were able to dig up a study in 1998 of what it costs to recover lost data in general, averaged over thousands and thousands of instances. And if you get the data back, the estimate in that report is $557 per host. However, you don't always get it back, and it's hard to estimate what data that you don't get back ever costs you, because it has such wildly varying value. But in the report, they went with, well, $10,000 is not unreasonable, and in general, historically, 20% of the time, you don't get it back at all. So that's an extra added cost of about $2,000 per incident. So you could cause, on average, and there's a lot of slop in this number, but that it's not a totally bogus number. $2,500 per machine, and if you're sitting on 1 million of them, there's $2.5 billion worth of damage. Okay, so if you could get those machines, you've got quite a weapon in your hands, and it's appealing both for small groups and for nations if they think they can get away with using those machines as a weapon without some sort of counterattack. How do you get them? You get them with worms. What is a worm? For our purposes, our definition is a worm is self-replicating and self-propagating. So it's something that takes advantage of services existing in the network to make copies of itself and move around through the network. As opposed to a virus, which for our purposes we define as that requires user action to spread. Because viruses require user action, they spread it more at human time scales rather than automated time scales. Worms are not new. I'm sure there are many here who remember the Morris worm now almost 14 years ago. I get different numbers on exactly how much infection the Morris worm caused, but it's in the range of 5 to 10% of the whole internet at the time. So it was quite successful as worms go. And then there's been a ton since, most of which have not been on people's radar because they've only gotten thousands of hosts or something. They haven't really been big. However, last year we had CodeRed, and that sort of changed the scope. Now, I know some of you are very familiar with this. On the other hand, I imagine some of you are not as familiar, so those who sort of lived through it all and know the details very well, please bear with me as I sort of set the context here. CodeRed, as far as can be figured out, was initially released on July 13th, 2001, and it went after a bug in Microsoft's IIS web servers, which unfortunately were enabled by default on all these otherwise desktop machines that didn't actually need a web server. It had a payload which was website defacement, and it spread by random scanning of the address space. So just pick a 32-bit number out of thin air and try to connect to the web server on that at that address. Most of the time, of course, that fails because the address space is fairly sparse. But now and then it works, and then now and then the thing you connect to happens to be an infectable IIS web server, and you've got a new victim. That's the scheme. The authors of CodeRed botched the random number generation. So it's surprising how often that is a fundamental bug in various things related to security. They failed to seed it, so it meant that as the worm spread, all of the infected hosts went after the exact same sequence of random addresses. So if you happen to be one of those random addresses, you got pummeled. But if you weren't, you never saw the worm. This meant it grew linearly. It was detected, analyzed, the bug was pointed out, and 6 days later, the bug was fixed. And we got a new version, which is called CRV2, though in general I'll call it CodeRed for the rest of what I'm going to discuss. So that's on July 19th. And now it has a different payload. It's a flooding attack on www.whitehouse.gov. That's not quite right. It's a flooding attack on the IP address corresponding to www.1.whitehouse.gov. So it was hardwired to DOS this one particular server. That was a mistake because it meant that whitehouse.gov could just change the DNS entry for that server and change the address of that server. And now all these zombies are going after an address that there's no server there. That in turn led to a bug. So the worm was modal in that for the 1st to the 19th of each month, it would attempt this random spreading. And then on the 20th, it would switch to flooding. It would do flooding of the address, the White House address, until the end of the month, and then it was supposed to start over. However, when it couldn't connect to the address, that triggered a bug which caused the worm to die. So the host infected, the infection would still be there, but it would do nothing. It would just sit there. However, they did as I mentioned, fixed the number generator seeding, and that led to much, much more rapid growth. Now, this is data from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is running BRO, the intrusion detection system that Sue mentioned earlier. You've seen similar sorts of stuff from David Moore's network telescope talk. LBL's got 2 class Bs, so the size of the telescope is 1/32,000th of the address space. Not as good a telescope as David's, but it's the data that I have easily in my hand. What this is on the 19th, it's counting up how many new hosts per minute were scanning port 80 at an LVL.gov address. So every minute we're counting up, whoa, there's 500 new ones we haven't seen before, there's 700, whatever. And we can see that, if I can get this, that the action peaks around 10:30, 11 in the morning Pacific time. And at that point we're seeing 1,800 new hosts every minute, hosts we haven't seen before. So we're seeing nearly, I'm going to always blow this map, 30 every second hosts we haven't seen before. It was really amazing. There's also this pattern, which is very sort of surprising or striking peak, goes up and then it trails back off, which fits with a population that is being saturated. Okay, so from just at LVL, we saw more than 300,000 hosts attacking LVL. And David's worked out some of the biases involved in these network telescopes, and from his bigger telescope gets about 360,000, 370,000 hosts infected. They got all that in 6-8 hours. Interesting thing about these worms is that the larger the population, the faster the spreading, because the worm is basically distributing out the work of spreading amongst all its members. So that night, it turns from the 19th to the 20th. The worm was supposed to go and flood. The flooding didn't work because the address had been changed, and so the worm dies. So it was really a pretty amazing time, right? I mean, on the 19th, there's enormous network activity, and then it's all gone on the 20th. And while the worm is dead, there's a few hosts out there with clocks that are really, really far off, and they don't know that it's the 20th. They think it's September or May or whatever, or just earlier in July, and so they keep going. But it's way fewer than most of them. However, it just takes one of these, come August 1st, to start spreading the worm again, and all the hosts with the correct clocks are again vulnerable come August 1st. And sure enough, that's what we get. So so this is midnight Pacific time. The worm's actually based on Greenwich time, so 8 hours back or so it starts to spread again, and it's clear that we're seeing the same spread, same sort of growth pattern as before. We do get a secondary effect, which is in the evening, machines are turned on and they get infected as well. Now the rate here, though, is quite a bit lower, and you can see that roughly half of the machines got patched in the less than 2 weeks from the first incident. 3 days later, we get CodeRed 2. This is actually totally unrelated to CodeRed. I mean, it's a different code base, but there's a comment in the code that says CodeRed 2, so that's its name. Payload has changed. Now it's a root backdoor, and it's resilient to reboots. So if you CodeRed 1 was memory resident and you rebooted, it was gone. But CodeRed 2 sticks around. But they blow the portability, and it only works under only works under Windows 2000. It crashes on NT. You know the story. The scanning has changed too. It's now got a notion of localized scanning. This is an attempt to make the worm spread faster, and it displaces CodeRed 1. 6 weeks later, we get Ninda. Ninda is yet another written, completely separate worm. And the interesting thing about Ninda is it spreads using multi-mode spreading. It's got a bunch of ways to spread. It doesn't just do the address scanning. What are these ways? Well, it will attack IIS servers just like CodeRed. It also does the usual email yourself around as like many viruses do, going through the address book. It will copy itself across open network shares. These are still widely used. It's amazing. It also would modify web pages on infected servers so that if particular vulnerable clients came and surfed the page, they would get infected. That's a nasty one. And then it would also go and look for these root backdoors left behind by previous worms. So it's parasitic off of CodeRed 2 and sadmin. I like that one. That's pretty clever, And it also highlights how these things, in a certain sense, start to form an ecosystem. One of the really interesting things about it is because it's multimodal, it jumped across firewalls. There are sites that didn't have any problem with CodeRed 1 or 2 that Ninda ravaged because it was much better at crossing firewalls due to these email tricks and this put up the poison page on the web server trick. Another interesting thing about Ninda is the payload is not known. I mean, it's understood how it spreads. Exactly what it does, whether there's some time bomb in there, it's just not known, and that's because it takes quite a few resources to, crawl through a non-trivial program and really determine what it does. This is what the onset of Ninda looked like at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. This is connections per hour, and you can see that it was an enormous spike when it first came out, over 300,000 connections per hour coming in as it's trying to scan. Now, this is not taking into account the other ways it's spreading. This is just the scanning. And here's the action blown up, connections per second. And what I find sobering about this is the very rapid onset. So at 6:30 in the morning, the action starts where you start getting a elevated rate in connections per second, and it takes about a half hour for it to go to full-blown, nearly 100 connections per second, and just sustained as the worm spread. Here's a timeline of the worms. We start with CodeRed CRV2 or CodeRed 1, July 19th, huge spike, and then because it stops on the 20th, the way it goes, it comes back August 1st. This is a different metric. These are confirmed infected hosts. So we not only are we scanned by some hosts, but they send over the poison URL, so we can tell which of the 3 worms it is. CodeRed 2 comes a few days later, starts eroding the market share of CodeRed 1. CodeRed 1 dies on the 20th, as always. CodeRed 2 hums along on a weekly pattern. Ninda comes along and starts eroding the market share of CodeRed 2. CodeRed 2 is programmed to die at the end of September, and it does. So it's just gone. We don't see it at all. However, now this is all the way through this last summer. Ninda continues to attack, at LVL we see a couple hundred hosts every day attacking LVL, and it just continues and continues and continues. So it's endemic out there. The rate is going down, as you can see. On the other hand, CodeRed 1 has this resurgence, and it's a little weird how it grew for a while. I haven't been able to figure that out. But every month in a monthly pattern, it comes back. And for a while, it grew and grew and grew. And now it sort of sustains itself at right around 2,000 different hosts attacking us every day during the peak of its cycle. It's still totally quiet from the 20th to the end of the month. I've looked at August and September. It's roughly still staying flat. So we have this ecosystem out there of just worms constantly trying to attack, and a lot of you are very familiar with that. Okay, so that's what we've seen and what we've endured. And where the sort of research began was thinking about better worms, meaning more effective worms. And we're very interested in this because we believe this threat posed by worms is really big. In particular, these worms were not all that well designed compared to what one could do. And we're concerned that it just took us hours, in some cases, to figure out better ways to make the worms spread. So it seems clear that someone nasty who is thinking about worms will also rapidly realize you can do a lot better. There's several ideas for going faster. One is, when you do this random scanning, it's completely uncoordinated. Every host that's infected is just randomly scanning the address space, and that's wasteful. That's particularly wasteful when the worm's really large. So instead, you want to just implicitly coordinate the action of the worms. And one way to do this is you consider a permutation of the address space, and this is a schedule that you're going to use to walk through the address space. The worms agree, each copy of the worm knows the schedule. And then as a new instance starts, you don't start at the beginning of the schedule, you just jump randomly into the schedule. Furthermore, as the worms go and infect, if they can tell when they infect a host that that host has already been infected, then they know there's another instance of the worm working their piece of the schedule and a bit ahead of it. Right? Someone else already got here, and that means someone's working the schedule right around where I am, and they're ahead of me. So, again, you re-randomize. These are simple tweaks. This is easy stuff to add. And yet it makes an enormous difference, because it means that rather than having tens of thousands of worm copies all sort of pounding on various addresses at random, those 10,000 are all divvying up the address space into essentially 1/10,000th of its size. You spread much faster. Once you have this, it means when the worm's big, it goes really fast. But you still have the problem of getting big. And that one is not so hard to solve either. So the key observation is you want critical mass, and critical mass is not that big, but it's not one host. It's on the order of 1% of the population or something. You want something significant. And so the notion is you construct what we call a hit list, which is a collection of vulnerable servers that you find by scanning or so forth. I'm going to return to this in a minute. And now when you start up, you start from the hit list. You get those by brute force, and then you use coordinated scanning as you go beyond. And then you can just crunch the modeling of how this behaves and run the simulation. And if you've got 1 million vulnerable hosts, your hit list is 10,000, so it's 1%. Your worm scans 100 addresses a second, which is attainable if you don't botch your threading. It takes 1 second to infect when you find someone vulnerable. Then you get 99% of that million in 5 minutes. That is a problem. That's very fast, way faster than the hours. Unfortunately, you can go faster still. Once you think about these hit lists, then the notion of, well, how big could that hit list be? Is 1%, the limit? Can we get more? And so suppose you've got the entire hit list. How do you get it? Well, it depends. You could just brute force scan. So you work out the size of sins, resets. You can see if you have an OC12, you can get the whole address space, all 2 to 30-second addresses in about 2 hours. Of course, that's going to really be a flagrant profile of scanning. On the other hand, thanks to these endemic worms out there, people are totally used to being scanned on port 80 all the time. Anyway, in fact, amazingly, because CIAC publishes their list of what are the most dominant scans and the like that we see, and 80 is never even on it, which I think means no one ever bothers reporting port 80. Okay, that's one way to get it. Another way to get it is distributed scanning. You get zombies and divvy up the work among them. Last year, we were the recipients at Lawrence Berkeley Lab of about 10 of these distributed scans. They're pretty impressive. You're sitting there, and suddenly 100 hosts out of nowhere come and scan you for 10 seconds or whatever, and they got you. I mean, they are not redundant. They're divvied up the address space and in your scan. If you're patient, you can just use low-rate scanning and spread your scanning to build up this hit list over months. And then there's other ways of trying to prime out the information. You know, like you may make guesses based on walking the DNS. Like if you're looking at web servers, you might just get all the .coms and look for www. And then that host name. You might see what you can get out of the search engines. They know the names of tons and tons of web servers, of course. Or you might just listen. You know, and some protocols like Peertopeer, you can just join in and see what comes your way. Or listen to the existing worms, right? I have a list of 2,000 CodeRed hosts just because I know that they attack me every day, so there they are, I've got their addresses. Okay, so suppose you can build up this list. Now the game is changed and you can go really fast. So you start out, you've got the entire list, and you're going to each generation and take the list and divide it up by some branching factor in. And so the first copy of the worm takes in entries off the list, goes and infects them, hands them 1/n of the entire list, and they do this the next generation 1/n squared, 1/n cubed. And there's ways to engineer this so that you don't have to copy the list around. The list is not actually all that big. And then there's problems with failure, and you'd like to take advantage of locality, and you know, there's a lot of engineering to really get this done right, and we haven't done that engineering. But you can just do the math, which is, say the branching factor is 10, then it takes 7 generations to get 10 million hosts. And depending how long a generation is, it's going to be a few seconds. It's not going to be a lot longer than that. You get tens of seconds, and you've got your million, or in this case, 10 million hosts. And then there are other techniques which we didn't explore in depth, but we know, which is one that looks particularly virulent is topological worms. And these are worms that use, once they've infected a host, they rummage through the host to get information about other things to infect. For example, you could go through the host web server logs or its SSH known hosts or so forth. And the point here is that just because of the application level network, you can track its topology, and you know that it's going to be a very high proportion of hits. You're going to get good servers just by the records they've left in the past, proving that they're out there and that this host you're on talks to them. If you do this topological scanning, then it's a lot less anomalous because you're making connections that have already been made in the past. And if the interconnection topology is rich, you can go really fast. So this is worse. The Morris worm did some of that. Okay, how do we defend against these? I mean, it seems quite possible you can build them, and the time scales are way below human response. Even CodeRed is pretty much below human response. But these, where you've got at most tens of minutes, even or just a minute or something, it's a whole other game. So you need automated detectors, and you need automated response. And perhaps you can use deception too, honeypots to slow down the worms. This is really hard. I'm going to return to this point. But it's also only half the problem, because we thought of another way to be nasty. We call these contagion worms. Now, contagion worms is not really a worm, but suppose you've got two exploits, one for a web server and one for a web client. And Ninda has this. So these are attainable. You start out with a server or a client, doesn't really matter, and you infect it, and then you just wait. And maybe you bait. Maybe you put up some juicy content that's going to bring people your way sometimes, but you just wait. And then as the clients come, you check, and if they're vulnerable to the client exploit, you infect them, and then you send over both the server and the client exploit. And then you just sit there. And then as the client happens to surf other sites, the infection on it is going to see if they're vulnerable as well, and if so, it's going to infect them with the server exploit, and again send over both the server and client exploits. So the key is here, no communication patterns change at all. You're just parasitically writing the existing communication patterns. The only change is the transfers are slightly larger, because now there's not only the content, which you continue to correctly propagate, but there's the worm. So how bad can this be? In particular, what was very sobering for us to realize peer-to-peer is just primo for this sort of infection. So first, you may only need a single exploit, because the peer-to-peer, the server and the client are co-resident, and they're basically the same thing. So that lowers the barrier to entry. The peers are often running identical software. There's monocultures in peer-to-peer, particularly in the big, highly successful peer-to-peer. They're all about rich interconnection, so they've got that nice topology. They're used to move big files around so that your little worm on top of a JPEG or MPEG or whatever it is going to be very hard for any sort of anomaly detection system to find. They tend not to be mainstream, so there's not, there aren't IES plugins for Nutella and the like. Depending on your goals, you can be sitting on user desktop rather than servers. That's nice. They've already got a control data dissemination plane, so you can control the worm. You've got the, and then the final point is they can be really big. So here is a large university's Kazaa traffic in Morpheus. This was measured a year ago, back when Morpheus and Kazaa both used Fast Track, which was port 1214. Morpheus has since moved off to Nutella. But anyway, this is port 1214 traffic at this university, and it's measured in gigabytes a day. So the university is doing about 1.5 terabytes a day of Kazaa. And then here's the Christmas break. Everyone, well, the students all go home, and then they come back. And I'm struck at how steady this is. Just every day it's right around 1.5 terabytes. That's a lot of traffic. And in particular, suppose that you broke into that university and you owned all of its Kazaa servers. How many connections does the university make every day to other Kazaa servers? Now, this is crunched off of the November logs. These are confirmed established connections. So TCP SYN handshake completes. It's not scanning or anything. SYN and SYN. So it was a completely normal connection. So suppose that every one of those connections allowed you to infect. Which maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. It would depend on the exploit. The first day of November, we get more than 500,000 new hosts we've never seen, because we're starting the numbers, the statistics. So 500,000 hosts talked with the university over Kazaa. 500,000. Wow. And then the next day, it's a little over 400,000, because a few of them, are ones we saw the day before, but there's 400,000 new ones we didn't see the day before, and so on throughout all of November. So even near the end of November, we're getting a couple 100,000 hosts we haven't ever seen before. And some of this is going to be DHCP aliasing apps and so forth. So it's not a perfect number, but it's roughly, you get the idea, this is an immense population and active. In particular, if you controlled that university, then at the end of the month, you talked with 9 million remote hosts. 9 million distinct IPs made successful TCP connections with the university's Kazaa. And if you had an exploit, so Kazaa is a monoculture. It's fast track. There's probably 2 or 3 flavors of it, and that's it. So if you had an exploit, you could just sit there and at the end of the month have 9 million hosts. Does it take a month? No, because that first day you've got 500,000 more servers out there spreading the contagion on your behalf. So clearly it's not going to take a month. It's probably going to be a lot faster. It's a little hard to compute because you have to understand the interconnection patterns, not only at the university, but also elsewhere. And then on the other hand, you might also cheat. You might try to decide, well, we won't just passively go where the user goes. We're going to make a few connections on our own just to spread the worm. Okay, so what we've sketched here are a number of very nasty worms that we believe quite plausibly can be built. And we already outlined that once one has this capability to get 1 million hosts, you can do enormous damage. Now move to the last part of the talk, which is, what can we do about this? Stuart came up with this analogy it's very two-edged sword. So the analogy is, we've got a Center for Disease Control in the U.S. for infectious diseases, and we need the cyber equivalent. Now, the reason the analogy is so slippery is one of the big pluses is it sticks in people's mind. Okay, Center for Disease Control, I know what that is. And that's a useful thing for like Washington, where it really does matter that you've got a tag that is going to help people remember what you're trying to push and so forth. On the other hand, it's also glib. There's a lot that is not at all analogous between human disease spread and computer. And this has really proven a lightning rod. We've gotten hate mail on this and accusing us as, we want to go off and build this thing, and no, we do not. But we want very much to get dialogue going on, well, what should be the response? And if this is it in some form, some sort of Center for Disease Control, what would it look like? So take that in mind. This is us, sketching what would go into such a beast as we've thought about it, and we really are looking for dialogue and not trying to make this happen as we envision it. So what would it do? Well, you need to identify outbreaks. That's basic. You want to know that the worm's out there, and so you're going to need sensors, large set of sensors, and some sort of decentralized communication mechanisms, decentralized so they can't be targeted, that lets you take in the information from the sensors and make determinations. And one idea we've been working on here is a notion called wormholes, which are distributed, basically just tunnel endpoints you scatter throughout the network in some fashion, boxes, address space, and whatever goes there gets routed to a honey farm, which is a collection of virtual machines running servers, and you're monitoring the honey farm. You know that the servers in there should never ever make an outbound connection because they're your servers, and that's not part of their job. So if and when they do, they're infected with a worm, because that's sort of by definition. Something came in and exploited the service and is trying to spread. You need to rapidly understand what the thing is you've got. And there's two parts to this. There's how does it spread? And then there's what else does it do? What's the payload? So for this, you're going to need human experts. That's just no automated way to understand this. You can do some on the spreading because you can run it in a lab and see what it does. But for the extra payload, it's going to be very difficult to understand. Even with these experts, it's going to be very difficult to understand. The state of the art in code obfuscation is grim for those who want to understand what the code does. In particular, static analysis is pretty much completely defeatable by various coding techniques. Okay, so you need a well-equipped lab and archives to do this. And you're going to want to do this even if it's one of these very rapid worms, because you're going to want to know what happened to you. What do you expect to happen next? You'd like to fight infection. This is the really dicey one. You'd like ways to somehow keep the worm from spreading. Well, what that's going to mean automated mechanisms to push out some way to identify the worm and stop its traffic. Huge issues here over who controls it, what's the liability when it screws up, how resilient is it if it's targeted. Maybe there's a model like the emergency broadcasting system where you've got automated ways to push out signatures and very much locally control policy decisions as to what you do with those signatures. And then one idea here is for these flash worms, so what if you had the hit list in advance? What if you, the good guy, the white hat, go off and do the scanning also and build up the hit list? Then early in the flash worm, early meaning like the first few seconds, you might know with good probability this is the target it's going to go after. It's going to go after this set of hosts. And then you could do something with that. I'm not saying this is at all easy. I am saying it's something that needs discussion. You want to track new applications as they come. analyze the threat associated with those applications. It would be really nice to know what the next kazaa is. What are its deployment, what's the extent of its deployment, how does it intercommunicate, what's its worm potential. And as you do that, then you'd like to start developing IDS plugins so that you can track what's going on. You would like, in general, to be working on this problem in the large. As you know, Steve commented for the previous talk, you know, the fundamental problem, of course, is buggy software. And you don't want to ignore that in terms of how you respond to the overall threat. But that's a very long-term issue. And so, you know, as we sketch this, we think about this, we think, well, you know, this sounds hopelessly hard. I mean, that's a really big thing. And part of what makes it hard is, I think, trying to convey or trying to assess what really is the magnitude of the threat. Are we talking about a $10 billion threat? Are we talking about a $100 billion threat? This is clearly a threat. Are we talking even bigger than that? Because there's a lot of pain in trying to build up such a response and a lot of resources and the like. And that's not going to happen without an appreciation that this really is a big threat. On the other hand, to us, it seems clear this is a really big threat. It may not be today, it will be soon. You know, today, you might do a few $1 billion damage. We have a scenario where we think you could do $100 billion today. And down the line, though, that's just going to get bigger and bigger. So if you take that threat seriously, and you want an open internet, because another response to this is, well, you really tighten down who can talk to whom. You know? Then what else do you do? How else do you address it? So I'll stop there. Interested in comments, questions? Leave you with a thought.
No, don't leave. That wasn't the ending I expected. And I think we're going to have some comments, sort of a downer, Vern.
I have a little bit of address space that I run listeners on, and if there were a place I could send my reports, I would. So I think you would find a lot of willingness here to participate in something if there were, you know, gee, this is the protocol, this is the address you connect to, and anything you learn, please send it here. But I don't think this is the audience where you get the money to do it.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I've had folks that various providers have talked informally with who said, you know, this, at least the distributed sensors, that's something we could start working on building, and we should.
Thank you, Vern.